It was in the summer of 1892 on here in the town of Earby where a horrific act of violence took place. And it involves that of a 38-year-old woman by the name of Eliza Cudworth, whose life was abruptly taken from her by her husband Moses. It rocked the residents of Earby and nearby Skipton to its core. And today we're going to go on the trail, the pathway where that horrific act of violence took place.
Eliza Cudworth, a 38-year-old mother of four, lived a modest life in the shadowed streets of Wesley Place. Her home, shared with her husband Moses, a weary 40-year-old weaver, and their children, bore the weight of nearly 2 decades of shared trials. 19 years of marriage had forged their bond, yet it also bore the scars of relentless hardship and unspoken sorrows. Their children, Alice, John, James, and the youngest, Cabrina, tenderly nicknamed Katie, were the light in their often dim existence, though even their laughter was sometimes muted by the struggles of daily life. Adding to the crowded household were Emma and James Philon, relatives of Eliza, who sought refuge under the same roof. Together, they formed a patchwork family, bound not just by blood, but by the unyielding resilience born of necessity in a world that often seemed unforgiving. But on Saturday, the 4th of June, 1892, all their lives would be changed forever.
The walk from Wesley Place and the home of Eliza and Moses would bring them to here. It is known as Hilltop Lane, and back in the latter stages of the 1800s and the early parts of the 1900s, it was also known locally as Old Lane. Now we do have to be mindful that there is an actual Old Lane set further back in Earby, just roughly in that direction. And it has taken a little bit of research to pinpoint exactly where today's story took place back on the 4th of June 1892. And we can 100% certify that that attack took place on this lane known as Hilltop Lane. We have found newspaper reports, newspaper articles, which clearly states that Hilltop Lane is where this horrendous attack on Eliza took place. And it's at the summit of a hill. And we'll put a newspaper article over so you guys can actually see for yourselves. But it says it was close to the summit and to where a gate enters onto a field. It was as Eliza and her daughter Katie were walking along this exact route that Moses himself joined up with them. And from all accounts, the actual trip to Barnoldswick was already rearranged between Moses and Eliza that day. And they'd agreed to take their young daughter Katie, who was around 4 years old at the time of these events. But they had agreed to take the daughter, well, it wasn't in Barnoldswick, but it was on the path to Barnoldswick, which is this path. Now, somewhere along this stretch, there was a wooden hut. And from all accounts, it was this wooden hut, and it must have been the owner, that they were going to buy these wooden clogs from. Whether or not they made their way to the wooden hut, nobody is quite sure. But along this path is where Moses and Eliza, and as well as obviously Katie, they would catch up with each other. And it's along here, like I keep saying, where that attack took place. As you can hopefully see through the camera, the path back in the 1800s may well have looked something similar to this. There would have been no tarmac, and obviously nothing that resembles paths of today. So in 1892, Eliza and the young daughter Katie would have walked along this barren stretch here through this field where a pathway used to be to make their way to a gate at the end of this field. Now, the newspaper articles clearly state that Eliza and her body, it would later be discovered just past a wooden gate and in a field just at the top of the summit. Now, I'm just hoping that the camera's picking it up, but where myself and Vicky's walking, there is somewhat of an incline, and you can see the old pathway that we're now walking along. And there is some old gates up here, or some old fences. So we're going to make our way there now. We know, again, from using the old newspaper archives, that there was a gate towards the end of this field. This is the gate, so this is where Eliza, Moses and Katie were making their way, and there is an old pathway that goes across that field towards Barnoldswick. We know Eliza's body was found in a hollow in a ditch close to the gate, on one of the opposite sides of that gate. Now, there is no ditches on that side, there is on this side. Eliza's body was found somewhere around here. There's a little brook that we know was prevalent back in 1892. Again, the articles state this clearly. And if we look carefully, we can see flowing water. It's more prevalent further down, you actually see more water, but we know this is the exact spot where that attack took place. So this is where Moses killed his wife, Eliza. The injuries to Eliza and what Moses did all those years ago were horrific. It seemed that Moses had made his way up along this lane, caught up with them at some point before an almighty row took place right here. Moses asked Eliza for money so he could go to the local alehouse back in the town itself. Eliza said no, not at this time. They were going to go and buy these wooden clogs from this, like I said, from this wooden hut. Moses wouldn't take no for an answer. They've had a big row. He's picked up a stone, quite a large, substantial stone at that. He's then proceeded to bash Eliza around the head. And we're going to get into details of what those injuries were shortly, but they were horrific. What I will say now is that the autopsy, the post-mortem, it would reveal that nearly every bone at some stage or at some point in Eliza's head were broken. Now, poor little Katie was witnessing all this at the time, the attack on her mother, and she shouted to her daddy, "Daddy, stop, no, Daddy, stop." We know this was said because there was a witness who heard the screaming and the shouting from further down in the direction we've just come from. So there were witnesses. They may not have seen the attack, but they certainly saw the three people making their way along here, and one witness in particular heard the screaming coming from here.
Don't do it, Daddy. Don't do it.
I think this is a better camera angle of where the body of Eliza would be discovered. Like I said, we know she was found in a hollow ditch close by to a small brook or a small stream. And if you look, there is an incline there and there's an incline here, and this is where this little stream is flowing. But just like all the other stories, and I've just said this to Vicky off camera, there is an eerie feeling about this place, knowing what happened all those years ago. This is the location where her horrific murder took place back in 1892, and one that took place in front of a 4-year-old little girl. Now, I think I've said it on more than one occasion about, obviously, the remnants of the past still being here to see. And no doubt that these flagstones and these old boulders, they would have been here back in 1892. These would have witnessed that attack on Eliza. And if only stones and trees could speak, it'd be interesting to know exactly what occurred. I mean, we do know what occurred, obviously. We know she was attacked. We know Eliza died here in such horrific circumstances. But if only the past could speak to us through bricks and mortar and stone, it would be fascinating. It really would. Now, just like today's weather and how bad it's been in the last 24 hours, we have had Storm Bert, which has hit the UK. And we are now just suffering the after effects the day after. And just like in today's story, back in 1892, the weather changed throughout the Saturday evening into the early hours of Sunday. And any remains or remnants of blood that was left behind from the attack on Eliza were washed away through that late evening. And again, historically, we know this is the fact because the newspaper articles from 1892, one of them in particular is by a journalist that made his way to this exact spot. And he would describe how it was drizzly, it was windy, the area itself. There was a lot of curiosity seekers who had made the pilgrimage, not just from Earby itself, but from Skipton, which is only a few miles away, but they'd actually made the journey themselves here to see for themselves the location, just like what we're doing today, myself and Vicky. They wanted to see with their own eyes where this horrific attack took place. But when the journalist made his way here, there was no sign of anything untoward having ever occurred. Like I said, any remnants of any blood that may not have been washed away by the authorities after the discovery of the body, that had gone because of the change in the weather. But like I said, this weather didn't stop the curiosity seekers from coming to this location for showing this morbid curiosity. And when people ask us, what is it about these type of stories myself and Vicky like to cover and why a lot of you guys enjoy these stories, it is that morbid curiosity. So even well over 100 years later, people like ourselves, like you, the viewer, we are intrigued, we are fascinated with these kind of stories and what one human being can do to another. Why we have this morbid fascination, it is very hard to explain. But the fascination is there, and by all accounts, it's always been there. At 3:20 p.m. that afternoon, and within 30 minutes or so of the attack on Eliza, Moses made his way to the home of a Mr. John Booth. And he threw 2 shillings onto a table and said, "Fetch me gallons of beer because I'm going to need it one last time." Now, obviously, Moses, he wasn't alone. He brought with him his little girl, Katie. And we have to bear in mind and reaffirm that Katie was only just shy of 4 years old. From all accounts, she was extremely upset. She was in tears at what, obviously, she'd seen her father do to her mother. And John Booth asked Moses what was going on and what's to do. And it appears that Moses was resigned to his fate. And he simply turned round to John and he said, "I've left Eliza up on yon hill. She's up there." And he kind of pointed in the direction of where we are now, Hilltop. Mrs. Booth came out and she was speaking to Moses and she saw how upset Katie was. And she says, "Why? Have you done away with her? As in, have you killed Eliza?" Now, shortly after, within 10 minutes or so of this, Emma Phelan, she had seen Moses enter the home of Mr. John Booth, and she went in to speak with Moses and ask her where Eliza was. Now, Moses at this point didn't hide the fact that he had attacked and murdered Emma's sister Eliza. And from reading between the lines, I don't think Emma truly believed what Moses was saying. So Moses held out his right hand, which was now covered in blood. And he says, if that doesn't believe me, go and look for yourself. And now Emma, she was in shock at this, but she didn't know where Eliza was. So she said, well, where is she? He goes, go and look. So Emma fled the home of Mr. Booth, and within several minutes, she met a man by the name of James Metcalfe. Now, James Metcalfe was walking along this pathway when he came across the lifeless body of Eliza, and he made haste back to the town of Earby to fetch help. And it is there when he met Emma herself. Now, Emma and James, they soon found a police constable by the name of Thomas Spencer. And after explaining everything that had just occurred in these last few minutes, all three of them made their way quickly to where Eliza's body was. When they discovered Eliza's body, she was in such a mess. She was barely recognisable. And like I said, her head had been crushed to pretty much a pulp. Every bone in her skull was fractured or broken. Importantly, in one of her hands was a clump of hair. It would appear that Eliza herself had fought desperately for her life, and she had managed to grab hold of the beard of her husband Moses, and she took a chunk out. Now, obviously, this was more than enough evidence to place Moses at this scene. Now, as the newspaper articles clearly stated, there is the running brook at the side of the pathway, and here it is quite deep, but it does run alongside the path all the way up and to where we've just been. Now, this clump of hair that was found in Eliza's hand, that may well have been enough to place Moses at the scene of this crime if he denied any knowledge of it. But they wouldn't need that. Upon his arrest by Police Constable Simeon White at John Booth's house, Moses admitted to everything. And when they were placing the chains on his arms, on his wrists, he turned around to the police constable and said, "You don't need them. I did it. I murdered my wife." We're going to make our way to where Wesley Place once used to be. But as you can appreciate, over the years, it has changed dramatically. It's nothing like it used to be. The houses that Moses and Eliza used to live in are no longer there. We do have an artist's sketch from 1892. It will be pixelated, but we are going to put it up over regardless. Now, we'll try to sharpen it just so you can get a feel for what it once used to look like. We know artist impressions back in the newspapers back in those days were quite, when I say detailed, they were quite accurate in how they displayed and how they gave the impressions of what places used to look like. So we're going to put that over. We're going to make our way there now. And like I said, we'll talk more about this case once we get there. Wesley Place, back in the latter end of the 1800s, early 1900s, was an extremely poor area. It was impoverished. So whether or not that had anything to do with the nickname Whitechapel, we can only presume, because we know obviously Whitechapel, 1800s, poor people, obviously the poor areas of London itself where these murders took place. So we think they nicknamed it Whitechapel because of the conditions that they lived here in Earby back in 1892. Now, coming into view is what was known as Wesley Place. And as I said a little earlier on in this video, this is where the poorest of the poor once lived back at the time of 1892 and the attack on Eliza. And directly in front, just here, is where Moses and Eliza once lived. We do know that there was several rows of terraced houses, and in one of those, like I said, was the home of the couple. Now, they shared their home with James, Eliza's brother, and Emma, her sister-in-law. And they were living together quite happily, from all accounts, for around 6 to 8 months. But it was only in the last 3 to 4 weeks when things started to sour. And Emma, at the upcoming inquest, she would explain in detail just what was going wrong between Eliza and Moses. And a lot of it, it seemed, would stem from drink and jealousy. So as we're saying, this area's changed dramatically over the years. It's been redeveloped. The houses are no longer here that were here back in the 1800s, early 1900s. But it was around here where the couple used to live with their 4 children. Now, it's a weird one because Katie, whose name was mentioned a lot in this story and in the newspaper articles, her name was actually Cabrini. But for some reason, her parents nicknamed her Katie, and so did all the local people around here who knew the family. She was always known as Katie. But we're going to put an 1891 census record over now, and you will see that Cabrini is Katie. And in that census records, I think it shows her age of being 2, possibly 3, because we know at the time of the attack, the newspaper articles will place her age at around 4 years old. So the sketch that I was talking about earlier, and that had appeared in one of the newspapers, we'll put over now. But you'll see just how tightly knit the terraced houses were. And like I said, this area was nicknamed Whitechapel, and we can kind of gather why, and especially if this was the poorest neighbourhood of Earby. Now, Eliza's house, we think, would have been somewhere around here. Now, if we pan around, you will see a public house, which is still here, called the White Lion. And it's this pub here where Eliza and Moses would often frequent. We know that Moses was a jealous man, and he didn't like leaving Eliza alone, and especially with one person. And that one person was a lodger that was staying with him 3 weeks prior to the attack on Eliza. When Eliza's body was discovered, and obviously more officers were informed, they went to the scene. They took her body back to here at Wesley Place on an ambulance cart. When they got back to her home, they laid her body out on a makeshift wooden table. They covered her body with a piece of cloth, a piece of rag. Now, one journalist who was quick to the scene wrote about how the house looked inside the interior. And it was dank, it was dark, it was miserable, it was smelly. It was one of the poorest hovels, as he explained, that he'd ever witnessed. Now, considering Moses and Eliza both worked as cotton weavers at nearby Albion Mill, they both had money, they were living in such squalor. It appears that they worked hard, they were kind of respected. They were happy in marriage for up to 19 years. Between 18 and 19 years they were married for. But something went wrong in those last 3 weeks of Eliza's life. But what was that? What went wrong? Well, we're going to touch upon that when we get to Earby Cemetery and where Eliza's body would be interred. Now, the funeral of Eliza Cudworth, it took place on Wednesday the 8th of June 1892, and a large gathering had made their way to Wesley Place and the home of Eliza. Her body was transported from her home and brought here to Earby Cemetery. Now, a public subscription was set up to receive donations from residents of here in Earby as well as nearby Skipton, and that was to pay for clothing for the young children. You see, even though both parents had good jobs at nearby Albion Mill, where they were cotton weavers, they were still relatively poor. So a public subscription or a fund was set up. A large contingent of people made their way here to Earby and to Earby Cemetery to pay their final respects. Now, sadly, there is no headstone today. I'm not sure if one was erected at the time. There probably was. It may have been significant, it may have been something small, but it is no longer here today. However, we did come across an article on a forum about the same story, which simply says that other interments were made in or close to the final resting place of Eliza Cudworth, and all that remained were 3 mounds. So we're going to have a quick walk round this small cemetery, and hopefully we may be able to find something that resembles these mounds, but we're not going to lay a flower simply because we cannot be 100% certain where Eliza is buried. Now, just to the bottom end of the cemetery, there are little divots, little mounds in this area, but again, it's so difficult to be certain of where Eliza could well be. Like I said, this article that we read on one of these forums is quite a few years old. So obviously, again, the cemetery itself will have changed over these years. But it is sad how this story took place, and it shocked the townsfolk, not just in Earby, but obviously surrounding areas. Barnoldswick, Nelson, Burnley, Colne, obviously Skipton. And yet, there is no headstone to remember poor Eliza. There's actually no grave number that we can source to even narrow it down. There's nothing that we can find online or in the newspapers which will give an indication as to where Eliza is interred. Now, it was on July the 28th, 1892, when the trial of Moses Cudworth took place at the Leeds Assizes, and he was charged with the willful murder of Eliza Cudworth. One of the first witnesses to come forward was that of Emma Phelan, and as we touched upon during the story, she would go into details of what transpired before, during and after the attack on her sister-in-law Eliza. She would go into detail how on the day itself Moses came into their home at Wesley Place asking where Eliza was. Emma turned around and said she'd gone up yonder hill with young daughter Katie to go and buy the clogs. Now, she turned around to Moses and said, "I thought you were with her." Now, Moses left the house, and this is when he encountered his wife on that hill line itself. He would then come back. He would ask Emma and say, "Where is she? I've been looking for her, I can't find her." And again, she would reaffirm that, yeah, she's gone in that direction towards Barnoldswick. Now, this was the last time she would see Moses until around 3:20, when she would witness him going into the home of John Booth. She would also detail how she followed Moses into John Booth's house and asked him, "Have you seen Eliza? Where is she?" And this is when obviously Moses showed his right hand covered in blood and saying, "Well, she's over there, go and look for her if you don't believe me." Now, another witness that came forward was that of Ralph Corsten, and he would detail how he found a knife, a penknife or a pocket knife of sorts close to where the attack took place. It still had elements of blood on the blade itself. Now, this pocket knife, or this knife, it was confirmed to be that of Moses by Emma herself. She was recalled to the stand to see if she knew about the knife, which she did. On the morning of the attack itself, this knife was found by Eliza under one of the pillows on the bed. An almighty row took place, and Eliza confronted her husband Moses, asking what it was doing in the bed. Now, Moses, he laughed this off, but in a blunt way, in an argumentative way, by saying he was using it to cut tobacco, obviously for his pipe, and that was it. But there were simmering tensions, and Emma would also detail that tensions were rising for at least 3 weeks prior to the death of Eliza. Now, another witness by the name of Thomas Williamson Cowgill was brought to the stand, and he would explain how he had heard the shouting and the screaming coming from the hilltop where we have been. And he would explain that he had heard this little girl shouting, "Don't do it, Daddy, don't do it." Now, Mr. Justice Grantham, he was leading this trial at Leeds Assizes. He asked Cowgill, "Why didn't you go back up the lane to see what was going on?" But Cowgill turned around and said he had other business in Earby. Now, Mr. Justice Grantham, he would kind of embarrass Cowgill to some extent. And he would say he was a disgrace to humanity for not going back and seeing what was occurring. After all, he clearly identified that scream as coming from a young little girl. Justice Grantham himself said, well, if you had gone back at that point, chances are this murder, this event would not have taken place, and Eliza would still be alive to this very day. Now, I don't know if the camera's going to pick it up as much as what we're seeing now, but storm Bert, even though it's kind of gone overhead somewhat in the last 24 hours, if you just look in the distance at the hill line, the weather is getting worse now and it's coming over in our direction. So we're going to wrap the story up, make our way back to the car. We've had a walk round Earby Cemetery. As you can see, it's one of the smallest ones we have been to whilst we've been covering these stories. And as I mentioned when we first got here, there is no sign of Eliza's grave, which is sad. As for the 3 mounds we were looking for, there's nothing now which jumps out at us. So again, we've tried to look. We brought you guys with us to Earby Cemetery and to where obviously the story kind of ends with Eliza. Mr. James Fullerton Hunter, he was a surgeon of Earby, would give results of his examination on Eliza. Now it is quite graphic, so be warned. The right bone of the lower jaw, the right and left upper jaw bones, the right cheekbone and the bones of the nose were all broken. The right eye was driven in and down. There were 2 wounds, each about 1 inch long, on the right side of the chin. The right cheek was one mass of contusion. The left eyeball was smashed and burst, and there was also contusions on the left side of the face. There were 4 superficial scratches over the windpipe and another on the back of the left shoulder. All the bones of the face were more or less splintered or broken, and some of the teeth had been broken off. The cause of death was shock and hemorrhage from the wounds. Now, as Moses was being removed from the dock, he shouted in a defiant tone, "Aye, he will have mercy, and them that have sworn against me will be there before me, and you," meaning the judge, "and all." Moses was executed on Thursday, 18th of August 1892 at Armley Jail over in Leeds. It was Billington who was his executioner. Now, during the Wednesday and the day before his execution, he spent most of this time writing letters to relatives saying how sorry he was and pleading for forgiveness. Obviously, it was too little too late. His attitude whilst in custody at the police cells in Skipton didn't show any ounce of remorse, and his defiant tone after being found guilty again never showed any kind of remorse whatsoever. So these letters, one could argue, we should take with a pinch of salt. On the day of his execution, even though he was a strong man, he was well built as well, after being pinioned and he shuffled his way to the actual gallows themselves, he began weeping and he kind of fought back against the people taking to the scaffold. But no sooner has he been placed upon the actual drop itself and the Lord's prayers are being read to him, the bolt was pulled and he fell into eternity. And it brought an end to what is such a tragic story. The taking of an innocent woman's life over jealousy and over, obviously, drink. These are the 2 things that were written about, the motives behind it all. And like I said, it wasn't just drink, it was also jealousy. But what was Moses jealous of? The jealousy factor behind this story seems to stem from when a young lodger took residence with the Cudworths, as well as obviously Emma and her husband James. So there were 5 of them sharing a very small building along with 4 children. So obviously the house itself was extremely compact. It was bursting at the seams with all these people. But this one lodger that had come to stay with them, he seemed to rile Moses. And from all accounts, Moses, upon his afternoon breaks or his breaks from work, he used to go home for his meal. And sometimes when he got home, he noticed that a mug, a pot or two had been placed together. And these two pots were belonging to his wife as well as this young lodger. And Moses kept moving them, separating them. It might have been something or nothing, but he got it in his head that something more was going on with his wife Eliza and this lodger. And this resentment and this jealousy kind of grew and grew and grew. And obviously mixed with alcohol, he snapped on the 4th of June. Now, nothing was ever proven, nothing was ever said that obviously Eliza was messing around with this younger man. And it seemed to be more in Moses' head. But he confided in John Booth 3 weeks before the attack on Eliza, and John himself said to Moses, you need to make this lodger flit. You need to make him move out of your lodgings, which he did. So 3 weeks prior to the attack on Eliza, this lodger was no longer on the scene. He had gone. Now, if you've enjoyed today's story and you enjoy this kind of content, please consider subscribing to the Days of Horror YouTube channel. We really do appreciate the support, and we always have stories coming each and every Monday evening at the same time at 7:05 UK time. So if this is the kind of content you do like and it interests you, please consider doing just that. Also, if you can, please share this video because it really does help the channel grow, and again, we do appreciate all the support you guys give. Now, in the meantime, we want you to take care, look after yourselves, and we will be back soon with more tales from a dark but at times glorious past. But stay safe and always stay curious.